Hello everyone, and welcome back to Inside Artscroll. Today we are privileged to be joined by the Boston Rebbe, Reb Naftali Horowitz of Boston, primarily to speak about the brand new book about his father, Rav Levi Yitzchak Horowitz, and the book is called The Rebbe on Beacon Street. Much thanks to the Rebbe for coming down to Artscroll for this discussion. And before we start, I just want to ask the Rebbe's Rishus, just so that people don't get confused between the Heintiger Rebbe and the Friediger Rebbe, if I could refer to the Rebbe in the first person as opposed to the third person, if that's okay.
No problem whatsoever.
So before we start, I know the Rebbe had mentioned to me.
I'd like to just say a few words. It's Eisar Liakov. Before we begin this, we have to have in mind Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hu Batzor B'Shivya, and we've had this problem that's going on, the war in Eretz Yisrael. They should all be safe. And prior to that, just short before that, we had the terrible tragedy in Meron, where many of our brethren were killed instantaneously. And we see that during that period, who were killed were all different segments of Klal Yisrael, be it Hasidish, Yeshivish, Sephardish, the entire spectrum. And I mentioned to Rabbi Finkelman, the author, that it's very apropos because we have to deal with Ahavas Yisrael. And if you read the book deals with my father's life, that my father was able to have Ahavas Yisrael not only for those that were like him, but also those that were not like him, from all different segments of Klal Yisrael. So all of Klal Yisrael should be watched over and have HaKadosh Baruch Hu keep them safe.
There's no question that of all the unique characteristics of this book, one sees the Rebbe's Ahavas Yisrael overflowing throughout the pages that Rabbi Shimon Finkelman wrote so beautifully. And I wondered, reading the book myself, how was it growing up in a house, the son of a Rebbe, but specifically the son of a Rebbe and Rebbitzin whose doors were always open. And the book describes how the house was an open house.
Well, in truth, I didn't know anything differently. So since that's how I grew up, so this is how I felt comfortable. But truth be told, that at the end of the day, there was compensation that had to be done. For example, Leil Seder. My father had a Seder for a large crowd, 50 to 100 people. And usually a Seder is for a family, for the children, the grandchildren. Over here, I grew up knowing that the Seder is for the adults. And every adult was looked on, and it was what you would call not a children's Seder where you geared to the children, but it was geared to adults. So me as a young child, you would say, lost out, but not really, because my father knew how to compensate. For example, my father had the tradition, I don't know if it came from before him, to give every young boy a Seder plate. So I was so excited that not only my father had a Seder plate, but I also had a Seder plate. And of course, getting up to ask the Firkashis, the Manishtana, was also special because nobody else got up. So everybody understood that we were the children of the Rebbe. My sisters were the daughters, and my brothers were the sons. And it was not a simple thing because it wasn't like in a normal Rebbeisha family, you just sit back and you do it, but you have jobs to do and take care of things. But we were proud to be part of the family and the Rebbe and the Rebbitzin.
Now, before I get into the Rebbe's history, which is interesting, what possessed you to engage Rabbi Finkelman to write this book now?
Okay, the Rebbe's gone over 11 years. And it's a new generation. And I didn't want to have a situation, Vayokem Melech Chodesh Asher Lo Yodas Yosef. Even grandchildren and great-grandchildren would not know who their great-grandfather or great-grandfather were all about, or great-great-grandfather were all about. And Kal V'chomer ben Bnei Shel Kal V'chomer for sure. Those that weren't part of the family, but were close to him, grandchildren, they know that their father is an Elachayit, or their mother is a wonderful Jewish lady. I wanted that people should remember, and I felt it was time that people should understand what happened during his years and how it happened.
Now, there were books written over the years, even B'chayav of your father, about him, about his accomplishments. What makes this book different than perhaps some of the other writings that have been done about your father over the years?
I asked Rabbi Finkelman to do it, Reb Shimon, on account of his way, his unique way of looking at things, and he gives what you call a personal view of the Rebbe Zatzal as far as the people that were impacted. And each person is interviewed, or he takes from articles where they were interviewed. So this is a personal perspective from many different people who he touched.
Right, he interviewed dozens, maybe even hundreds of people in putting together this book.
Correct. So that was a different perspective, where the others were just saying over my father remembers, or what other people were told him, but not from a source.
Now, it's interesting, the book describes your father's history growing up, and one of the things that we find in the book is that he was the first graduate of Yeshiva Tarvadas to become a Rebbe. He's described as the first American-born Rebbe. I read in the book that your father learned by Reb Shlomo Hyman in Tarvadas. If you could talk for a moment about your father's upbringing and who were the influences in his life.
Well, the major influence in my father's life was his father and his mother. Don't forget that he was born in Boston, right by the Charles River, if anybody knows what Boston is all about, on the River Charles as we call it. And he grew up in an age when there was practically no Yiddishkeit there. And there was a section of immigrants, and my father didn't go to public school. My grandfather refused to send him to that type of education. And he grew up in many different ways of knowing what Yiddishkeit is all about. Here he was alone.
If he didn't go to public school, how did he get his education?
They let him have homeschooling.
Homeschool.
He had somebody who was his arithmetic teacher, I think it's in the book as well, who taught him the major skills that you need to have here in the United States. And then at the age of 13, my grandfather always strived to return to Eretz Yisrael, where he was from. He went to a completely different world. Torah V'Yira, which was of Ran Katzel Negenbeugen, who technically was from the Nekanoim of Yerushalayim. My grandfather lived in a chutzner at a young age, where he was together with Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and the Reb Dovel Tzvi Shlomo Leleva. It was what you could call from the greatest tzaddikim. So he was going from a place where there's nothing to a place where you had the highest types of Kedusha in our times. And later on, when they returned to America because they couldn't stay in Eretz Yisrael for whatever reasons, my grandfather moved to New York, and he learned by Reb Shlomo Hyman, who was a Talmid of Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, who was a Rosh Yeshiva by Rabbi Chanan. Was in Kamenitz by Rabbi Rebbe. So he had all different segments of understanding how you do Avodas Hashem. And that gave him the capability to understand you have to strive in whatever situation you are, in with whoever you are in contact with, to make them closer to Yiddishkeit.
So other than his father, Shlomo Hyman, was there anyone else in particular who guided his path, specifically his path in Chesed? Because he was able to...
Reb Shlomo Hyman was his Rebbe. Reb Shlomo was a big tzaddik, and he used to have some vretlich from Reb Shlomo Hyman. For example, Reb Shlomo Hyman used to say, the shlishi, it nishmachin kan Größere Rosh Hashiva, the kein kleiner Rosh Hashiva. It's not the end of the world not to get Shlishi, which my father always practiced. And he used to say, now Shavuos night is coming. Everybody wants to become a Talmid Chacham overnight. But that night you should also be able to sleep. So, but he was his Rebbe in understanding Derech Halimid, how do you learn up a Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos. But I would say in Chesed there was more my grandfather and grandmother. Mm-hmm. I'll give you several examples that I did not hear from my parents. I witnessed it alone. For example, my grandmother's Chesed, how far it went. One time I was sitting in the office in Boston, and this Italian lady who was around 85, 90 years old comes in. And she asks me, am I related to the Rabbi Horowitz from the West End, which was where his section was, where he lived? And I said, I'm a grandson. My father lived there. She said, yeah, your father was my age. You look much younger. But I want to tell you something. We used to live across the street from the synagogue. And it was during the Great Depression. And we didn't know what we were going to eat for the next meal. And your grandmother was kind enough, where in those days they weren't able to candle the eggs. Whenever there was a blood spot in the egg, she sent it over to us. And I want to thank you for it, from the bottom of my heart. So this was not a chesed for a yid, but thinking of what you can do for someone who's a guy who's taking care of it. In the same vein, my grandfather living in Boston was a big kanoi at the end of the day. I was Bacher in Ponevezh in the early 70s, and I had a friend, Shlomo Yosef Ovitz, who is a Vision Chassid, and he used to go visit the Moshe Zakenim in Vishnitz. And he came to me and told me, there's somebody who wants to meet you. And I went to this elderly gentleman, and he tells me, you're the Boston Rebbe's son? I said, yeah. He said, so you're the grandson of Reb Pinchas David, my grandfather? I said, yes. He says, yeah, I want to tell you. In the late 20s, early 30s, I was a Mishulach from Galicia to America, and I went to every single broken bed throughout the United States, and I came to Boston. And I went for a Shabbos to a suburb of Boston. And in that suburb, there was this Sheiner Rov, who was elderly, had Balabatim, Shabbos, they had a Chumash shir or Archaim, they had a shir Gemara Rashi. And after Shabbos, they were impressed that I sat with them, and they said they're looking for a new rabbi. The rabbi's ready to retire. Maybe I can become the rabbi. They'll make sure to bring over my wife and my children, and I'll be able to have a position. And it sounded very, very enticing. I said, I can't do anything before I ask a Rebbe. I like the idea. And that Motzei Shabbos, I went to your grandfather. And after Malava Malka, I went up to his office where he used to take people. I told him I have good news. I was offered this position. And he got up out of his chair and said, Chas v'sholom. And I was taken aback. I said, what's the problem? And he told me that at the end of the day, look at this rabbi, a Talmid Chacham, an Erlich Yid, but his children are completely unobservant. And his grandchildren already got married out of the religion. I don't want that to happen to you. And I started crying. And I asked him, what am I supposed to do? I can't do this anymore. I'm not born to be someone going from house to house, from broken bread to broken bed. He said, go to Eretz Yisrael right away. You might have hard times, but you'll live to see children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And I did that. My entire family was wiped out by Hitler in Yamach Shemoy. My entire village was wiped out. Your grandfather saved me. I couldn't give a yashikoyach to him. Let me at least give a yashikoyach to you, his grandson. This is the type of life that they lived in Boston. It was chesed, but it was chesed shalemes.
Your father, in addition to his unbelievable chesed, maintained amazing relationships with Gedolei Olam from across the spectrum. Could you talk for a moment about that? He had very unique relationships with many Gedolei Torah at a time when he was out in Boston in a midbar building Yiddishkeit, but he either took inspiration or he took satisfaction from having that unique connection. If you could talk about that and who those Gedolim were.
Well, when he started moving after he moved to Boston, which is a medical center, you can call it the medical capital of the United States. New York is the business capital. Washington, D.C. is the government capital. But in a sense, Boston is the medical center of the United States. They're at the razor edge of medicine. My father got his first opening to help Yidden from the Chazon Ish. It's mentioned here. The Chazon Ish sent a person for open heart surgery just when it became available. I think it was Dr. Harden, and it was maybe the 35th surgery he would be doing. Today, they do open heart surgery on a daily basis, every doctor 3-4 times a day sometimes. And his surgery came out right in the middle of the 9 days. And he came concerned to my father, saying, how am I going to go to surgery in the middle of 9 days, right by Tisha B'Av, Erev Shabbos Chazon? My father said, the same Malach that is going with his doctor a whole year will be going with you. But my father said, don't ask. Send a telegram. In those days, he couldn't pick up a phone and just call, somebody in Bnei Brak to go over to the Chazon Ish. And he received several days later a letter from the telegram saying that the same Malach that went with this goes with this doctor will go with you as well.
Almost the same words that your father had told him.
Basically the same type of words. So it was the Chazon Ish. Later on, he got a very close relationship with the Ponevezh Rov. He used to come to Boston. And in fact, the way I got to Ponevezh and my older brothers got to Ponevezh was through his relationship. Ponevezh Rov said, you're my host here, and we have a close relationship. I want your boys to come to me in Ponevezh. And without even getting what you call a bechina, a test, we accept your sons to be in Ponevezh, where it was difficult to be in Ponevezh, because Ponevezh did not accept Anglo-Saxons so much. Even my father had from his youth a close relationship with Rebbe Yishvei because they were classmates by Reb Shlomo Hyman. When I did go for a feher in Yeshiva Philadelphia, Rebbe said, Abachinim is a Bakumin. He has to get a test. It's not going to go without a test. So my father had relationships with the Rabbonim from his youth, and someone like Rav Moshe Feinstein or Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. He had relationships because of questions that arose in halacha, and he spoke it over with them, and they were always there to answer him because they knew his reputation of someone to give for Klal Yisrael.
Now, in addition to building an empire of chesed in Boston and spreading his Torah and Avodah from his base in Boston on Beacon Street, your father later in life embarked on an undertaking that many people at his age would have shied away from. And he decided to open up a shul in Har Nof. Speak about the fact that your father never rested on his laurels. That, again, at a later age, he undertook to spread the Torah and Chesed of Boston.
Well, first of all, my father was fond of saying all the time, everybody can retire, but a Rebbe never retires at the end of the day. And he had a dream always from the time that he was a bocha. When he met my mother, he said he wants to live in Eretz Yisrael, because that was what his father strived to return to Eretz Yisrael when he came to America. It wasn't done because he decided and planned that he's moving to the United States of America. It was done, in effect, under difficult circumstances, if you can read the book. And my father always wanted to return, and my grandfather bought a parcel where he would return to, and my father's dream was to have that dream fulfilled in his lifetime. So therefore, he moved to Eretz Yisrael, and many people that were close to him in the United States moved to Eretz Yisrael and brought up their families in Eretz Yisrael, and many of them were in Har Nof, where he had his Beis Medrash, and he grew close to these individuals as well.
And how was that kehillah different than the kehillah in Boston? In what way?
Well, you have to realize one thing, I didn't live in Har Nof so much. My brother, Baruch Hashem, runs it very well.
That's Reb Meir.
Reb Meir. And it was different that was my father's talent, that he could accommodate himself because of his prior experiences where he went from Boston to Jerusalem. In the same way, in his adult years, he took care of Boston. He was able to take care of Jerusalem because it's a different type of circumstance. Every place is different. Just like Lakewood is different than Borough Park to a certain extent, and Borough Park is different than Boston, and Boston's different than Baltimore. In the same vein, he knew how to be able to bring a varmkeit, a ruach, and an understanding of what it means to be a Torah Yid and to be an Oved Hashem. And that was very important to him. And it was different where, I would say, let's say in Boston, you won't find everybody coming to ask every single type of a question to you. They ask, they ask questions that are important, let's say for married life, for maybe where to send their children to educate, where in Har Nof, people would come to him on a daily basis for daily questions. Mm-hmm. And he was able to have the patience and the wisdom to answer them, that they feel that was also a special question.
Right, it seems like there were people who were newer to Judaism who were encountering the Rebbe in Boston, maybe more than Har Nof, where maybe fewer Baalei Tshuva and more of a
there was more people that were what we call popularly FFBs, and he knew how to handle them because he was in that type of an environment throughout his life as well.
Talk for a moment, going back to your youth, growing up. How many children were you and your siblings?
We were 5 children. I had 2 older brothers and an older sister, and I had 1 younger sister.
Right, so it was Reb Meir?
No, my brother Zatzal, Reb Pinchas, and then Reb Meir, and then Rebbetzin Frankel,
the wife of the
Yelapola Rebbe, and then myself, and then my sister Rebbetzin Geldseiler, who was Rav Moshe Chaim Geldseiler's wife.
Right.
Rebbetzin.
What was the relationship among the children, 5 children, growing up in that house?
Well, you have to realize that it wasn't so simple a relationship, because at the end of the day, when I was growing up and I remembered things already, my 2 older brothers were out of the house because they left the home at the age of 9 because my father wanted to have them a chinuch, a proper, full-fledged New York type of chinuch, and they were in Torah Das already.
Even as youngsters?
As youngsters, and I'm good 8 years and 5-6 years their junior. Mm-hmm. So I would say my father had his older children, and he had his younger children. My 2 older brothers and older sister were his older children, and my sister and I were his younger children. And what it was like, of course, Yom Tov we were together, but at the end of the day, we always felt loved by my parents, as busy as they were, but we were always asked to help. There was no such thing as not helping out in their endeavors.
What would you say the difference is between raising children when you were brought up decades ago to what the challenges are today?
There are different challenges. The challenges decades ago was that every Jewish family out of town, at least, felt that they should be part of the melting pot of the United States of America, and people weren't so interested in having a religious home. Sometimes, where that you had to strive for, and my parents and many other people in the Boston or out of town area were moise nefesh for that. Nowadays, the problem is even in the what you will call the metro Jewish areas, that there are different type of circumstances that are brought into the home through friends, and there might be even a bigger nisayon, a bigger test for us, because at the end of the day, your best friend's child might be not a good influence on your child, and for whatever the reasons are, be it the internet or other types of items that they can get a hold of or go to. And that's the biggest challenge that we have in our times.
And what do you think the key is? Maybe something learned from your father that parents, grandparents could use today to instill the proper values in their children and make sure that they stay strictly on the derech haTorah.
You have to keep open eyes, and it has to be chanoich lana al pi darkoi. Everybody has to educate their child to their potentials. Don't expect, if you have a boy, that he's going to grow up to be the Vilna Gaon. Halavai, he should become the Vilna Gaon. I wish everybody to have that type of nachas. But if he doesn't have that potential, don't discourage him to say you're not, which might be problematic. Your child is not worth it. In the same vein, when it comes to a girl, you should all be the biggest tzaddikus. But if you see something that is deficient, try to work on their good things rather than see all the deficiencies. That gives them a lot of discouragement.
Speaking about those who influenced you, you said before that you yourself learned in Panovich.
I learned in Panovich.
Where else did you learn?
Okay, I first went at the age of 9 to Torah V'das.
Okay.
I was called the baby of the dormitory. I was there with my older brother Rebbe, because they wouldn't accept me if I didn't have an older sibling. And I was there in the elementary school under the tutelage of Rabbi Pincus, who was the father of Reb Shimshon Pincus, and afterwards Rav David Bender, who was the father of Yaakov Bender. I even had a classmate, Shmuel Bender, that's a brother of David Bender, of Yaakov Bender, and I had a classmate, Rav Matis Pincus, who was a brother of Reb Shimshon Pincus. And after that, from Mesivta High School, I went to Yeshiva Philadelphia. And after Yeshiva Philadelphia, later in Beis Medrash, I was by Panovich, by Reb Shmuel.
Reb Shmuel Rozovsky.
Reb Shmuel Rozovsky, Zatzal, and Rav Shach and Reb David Pravowski. And you can learn things from them. Let's say, just little items. Reb Shmuel Kamenetsky soll sein gesund und stark. I learned something from him, nothing more. His punctuality. He was always punctual. Mm-hmm. Very important. If Shachris is 7:30, be there at 7:30. From Rav Shach and Reb David, who do you think were the first people coming to the Beis Medrash in the morning? Reb David used to come in around 4:30 in the morning to start learning.